morning and welcome. I'm sorry for the late start. We're in a slightly awkward position of having a speaker who's still on her way to the library, so we were stalling a little bit for her. We're going to go ahead and get underway. My name is Eric McGilvray. I'm Associate Professor of Political Science here at Ohio State. I'm also the coordinator of this year's COMPAS program on religion and public life. I'm very pleased with a very rich and full day ahead of us today with our conference on religion and the state. Before I start talking about the conference, let me say a few words about the auspices under which this conference is happening. The COMPAS program is a program of the Ohio State Center for Ethics and Human Values. Normally the person standing here welcoming you would be the director of the center, the founding director of the center, my colleague Don Heapin, who's Professor Emeritus of Philosophy. Don unfortunately was traveling this weekend and so wasn't able to be here, so I'm stepping in for him. There are a number of sponsors who very generously made this conference possible. Rather than read the list, I'll direct you to the back of your program, where there's a full list of the sponsors of today's conference and of the COMPAS program more generally. The word, or the acronym COMPAS, stands for Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society. And the conception of the COMPAS program is that the idea of a university, especially of a public university, should be to foster informed and civil discourse across lines of ideology, across lines of discipline, across lines of fundamental conviction, on matters of public concern. And so what the COMPAS program does is every year we pick a theme, some salient public topic, and we organize a series of events around that theme, again, each event having the aim of fostering civil dialogue across those boundaries. Previous themes have included immigration, sustainability, inequality, and so on. This year's theme, as I said, is religion and public life, which I think it's pretty obvious why that's a matter about which civil and informed discourse is called for. Before I get the program underway, I want to thank a few people. The most important thanks go to our wonderful graduate assistants, Lavender McKittrick-Schweitzer. Where's Lav? Stand up, Lav, and take a bow. Most of what you see around you, the amenities, the transportation arrangements, the meals, and so on, all of that is made possible by Lav's work and by Krista Johnson, our other graduate assistant who couldn't be here today. They really make the things run, and we're delighted to have them on board. They're very, very efficient and effective. I also want to thank Steve Brown, sitting to my left here, your right, who's the Associate Director of the Center for Ethics. Steve does many things for the center. Among the things he has done is design the lovely program that you're hopefully holding in your hands, put together things like this slideshow you're watching, and so on. He does a lot of things for the center, but those are the most visible probably at the moment. I also want to recognize Isaac Weiner. Where's Isaac? There he is. Isaac is my colleague in Center for Study of Religion here at Ohio State. He's done yeoman's work sort of helping to populate the conference program over the course of the year. Just a couple words about coming attractions, some of which you're going to see flashing before your eyes on the slideshow. Actually, right, he was just there. We have our next COMPAS event is on the topic of conscientious objection in medicine. Ought doctors to be able to refuse to perform certain kinds of medical procedures because of their religious convictions? We have two distinguished guests coming in to discuss that topic on February 26th. That will be here in Thompson Library down on the first floor. On April 12th, we have the philosopher Philip Kitcher and the biologist David Lottie speaking on science, religion, and democracy. The next day, we will have our third COMPAS conference on religion in global context here on the 11th floor of Thompson Library. If you wish to receive notices about upcoming COMPAS events, I can direct you to the inside of your program, and this URL, cehd.osu.edu/now. I know you can read it from where I'm holding it here. And among other things on that page, you will find information about how to sign up for notices about COMPAS events and other Center for Ethics events. With that, I'm going to toss to our moderator for our first panel, my colleague Amna Akbar from the Lawrence College of Law. She will introduce our panelists. We're dearly hoping that our third panelist arrives shortly. We're going to get underway without her, and for now, I'll toss it to Amna.
Thanks, Eric. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first panel on what promises to be a day of engaging discussion on religion, identity, and the modern state. This first panel, the one I have the great privilege of moderating, will focus on Islam and the liberal state. My name is Amna Akbar, and as Eric said, I'm faculty at the law school, and we'll be moderating both this first session, which will be focused on presentation and conversation amongst the panel, and then the second session, which will happen after the break, which will be focused on, we'll open up for a Q&A with the audience. So for this first panel, each panelist will present for roughly 15 minutes. And after each of the panelists has an opportunity to present to us, we will have a moderated discussion up here. Let me start by introducing our panel before turning it over to them in the order that they will be presenting. So on my far right, a Turkish journalist and author for more than a decade, Mustafa Akyol, has been writing regular opinion columns for Turkish publications like Hürriyet Daily News and for the New York Times. He's published 6 books in Turkish, including Rethinking the Kurdish Question, What Went Wrong, What Next? His 2011 book, Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty, presents an argument for Islamic liberalism. The book was longlisted for the Lionel Gelber Prize, a literary prize awarded by the University of Toronto for the best nonfiction book in English that seeks to deepen public debate on significant international issues. The book has been published also in Turkish, Malay, and Indonesian. And then for now, to my immediate right, Shadi Hamid is a senior, Hamid is a senior fellow in the project on U.S. relations with the Islamic world in the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution, and the author of the new book, Islamic Exceptionalism, How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World, which was shortlisted for the 2017 Lionel Gelber Prize. His previous book, Temptations of Power, Islamists and Illiberal Democracy in the New Middle East, was named a Foreign Affairs Best Book of 2014. Prior to Brookings, he was at the Project on Middle East Democracy and a Hewlett Fellow at Stanford University's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. He is a contributing editor at The Atlantic. And then finally, Zareena Grewal, who's not yet here, but we're dearly hoping she will be soon, is an anthropologist and documentary filmmaker who focuses on race, gender, religion, nationalism, and transnationalism in American Muslim communities. Her book, Islam is a Foreign Country, American Muslims in the Global Crisis of Authority, is an ethnography of transnational Muslim networks that link U.S. mosques to Islamic movements in the post-colonial Middle East through debates about the reform of Islam. And her forthcoming book, Is the Quran a Good Book?, combines ethnographic and cultural studies analysis with historical research to trace the place of the Islamic scripture in the American imagination. She has received awards from the Fulbright, Leonard Wren, and Luce Foundations. So with that, please join me in welcoming Mustafa Akyol to the mic.
Thank you. Sorry. Good morning, and thank you so much for the kind introduction and to the invitation to Ohio State. Shadi's book was shortlisted, whereas mine was longlisted, so I feel already inferior to the second panelist, but I'll try my best. I'll start with the question, is Islam compatible with the liberal state? I mean, our panel is titled Islam and the Liberal State, but I'll ask the obvious question, is Islam compatible with a liberal state? First of all, what is the liberal state, or a liberal state? Well, it's a state where citizens are equal before law. They are also free to pursue their ambitions, values, worldviews. They are free to follow a religion or not to follow a religion or change their religion. They are free to, live their life as single or families or transgender or whatever. And individuals are given the right to live freely unless they trample on the rights of others. It's an easy, of course, distinction, and it's harder to put that in practice sometimes. But it's a state like the US, you can say. Or Sweden, and which one you prefer might be depending on your political perspective, but let's say US is a good liberal state, based on the idea that there are inalienable rights which make us all equal, and so on and so forth. Now, is Islam compatible with a state like this? The answer to this question can be only answered by Muslims. And the answer will change depending on to which Muslim you're asking this question. I would say, yes it is, as I understand it. And there are millions and millions of other Muslims who will say, yes it is. They are, actually most of them are living in liberal states. They're happy to be living in liberal states. They're saying this is the best country ever. There are so many loyal citizens of liberal states. typically as Muslim minorities. There are also Muslims in the predominantly Muslim societies ranging from Morocco to Malaysia, Indonesia, who say, yes, we need more liberal states here. So they want to bring more liberalization to their states, to their countries. So a lot of Muslims think it's a great idea because, I can practice my religion in the way I want it, the state should not impose that to me. So a lot of Muslims are already convinced by the idea of a liberal state. So not every Muslim, in other words, is an agent of creeping Sharia, as some people think. But not all Muslims will say this to you. Some will have reservations about the liberal state. They will have reservations like, they will find some things immoral in society and, they would not want to see them around. Well, some of those reservations are actually, seen even among some conservative Christians in the West as well. They would not want to make a cake for a gay wedding, for example. Yeah, you can have a reservation in that sense. And, that's something actually you can argue for or against from a perspective of liberalism. But there will be even other Muslims who will say, no, this whole idea of a state that is liberal, that is not defined by our religion, which is Islam. That whole idea of a state like that is, no, unacceptable. We Muslims need to live under Islamic states. Because for them, religion is not just your personal observance, it is also your legal system. It's also the way you identify with the state. So therefore, there will be many Muslims who would deny the authority of a liberal state and who would consider liberal states as anomalies or illegitimate. They might bear with it if they're living under a liberal state, but they might aspire for something different. And they can be actively working for more Islamic states. We typically call them Islamists. So maybe it's fair to say that most Christians in the modern world have accepted the liberal state, at least Christians in the West. Whereas in Islam, it's a work in progress, and where it's going is a good question. Now, the Muslims who would object to a liberal state and want a more Islamic state typically have certain concepts in mind. And these concepts are, hot topics in the modern day as well. And I'll just highlight two of them. One is the concept of Sharia law. Because in that understanding, Islam is not just about doing your prayers, praying, 5 times a day, going to Mecca, the 5 pillars of Islam. These are personal observances. Islam is about also law, the law you're subject to. So the Islamists, for example, would say Islam requires that we bring Sharia, Islamic law, to the land. We want God's law to be implemented. And that law is, to great extent, illiberal in its at least classical interpretations. Like, is apostasy allowed in Sharia? In classical Islam, no. In other words, you can't change your religion. Well, you can change from Christianity to Islam or Judaism to Islam, but you can't change the other way around. You can't leave Islam and choose another Islam, for example. Or can you just, drink wine and, publicly and, commit certain sins? Well, in a liberal state, you can. But under the Sharia, no, that would, require floggings and, certain punishments because, you're corrupting the society by your sins. So there will be many clauses in classical interpretations of Sharia. Maybe better to say fiqh because it's jurisprudence and Sharia is the higher ideal, but I'm not getting into that. So, and if you say, I want Sharia the law of the land, which is also already law of the land in some Muslim societies, but not others, there is a compatibility. And some Muslims will tell you that if you're a Muslim, you have to want to live under the Sharia. It's your duty to ask for it. It's your duty to struggle for it. To bring Sharia or to. Of course, there are accommodations between liberal states and Muslims who want to abide by the Sharia. For example, the United Kingdom opened Sharia courts in family matters. If Muslims can voluntarily go to those courts and get a Sharia decision on inheritance, for example. I'm personally sympathetic to those arrangements. But again, the Sharia implemented there is a very limited one in the family law matter. It's not penal code, for example. So Sharia is one thing, an issue we have to work around. The other one is the caliphate. Some Muslims will say Islam requires that we have a caliph, we have a caliphate. This is not inseparable. In Islam, state and religion, din wa dawla, they cannot be separated. So our religion requires that we have a caliph. And we don't have a caliph since 1924, when it was abolished by my country, Turkey. There are some caliph wannabes popping up here and there. I mean, not too many. One crazy one came out of Iraq and Syria recently. Luckily, one of its territories was restored now. But some people think that, well, that was a bad caliphate. ISIS was too brutal, but a caliphate is a requirement. And a caliphate, by definition, probably would not be liberal. I mean, it would be defined by justice. Justice is a strong emphasis here. But it would not be liberal in the sense that not everybody would have the equal rights under a caliphate, political system like that. Muslims would be superior by definition. Non-Muslims would be tolerated, but not equal. And individuals would not have the full individual freedom as it would be defined by a liberal state. Now the question is this tension between the more conservative understanding of Islam, as we see in the, clinging for Sharia or Caliphate, is this a tension that is here with us to stay, which will never go away? This is what it is. Civilizations are different, clash of civilizations. Liberalism is a Western value. Muslims are going to never accept this. Accept it. So that's one way of looking at that. Another way of looking at this is to say, well, no religion came, as compatible with liberalism right away. There was a time that Christians thought that heretics should be burnt at the stake. A lot of people were burnt at the stake, and for being from the wrong sect of Protestantism or from the wrong sect of this and that. So Christianity went through a reinterpretation, especially during the era of Enlightenment. A lot of people make a lot of emphasis on the Protestant Reformation, but Protestant Reformation didn't bring us liberalism. The Enlightenment did it. A lot of thinkers from John Locke to others, they thought, went through, redefined the individual, that faith cannot be coerced, so faith should be based on freedom, and others, people who are from different sects should be tolerated. At some point, even atheists should be tolerated, which was a very wild idea, 8th and 7th century. So Christianity went through a process called Enlightenment, at the end of which, and it went on for a long time. It was only in the 1960s that the Catholic Church accepted what we would call basically a liberal set of values, with the Second Vatican. So Christianity went through this. Can Islam go through this? Is it maybe already going through this? Now, I tend to say yes, but Shadi, my good friend, says no. Because he says Islam is different. And he says Islam is exceptional. And I'm not going to, read his mind, and of course Shadi will go with his arguments, but I just want to say a few things on that. I think he has a point by saying that Islam is different than Christianity. Because in Christianity, there's no Sharia, there's no Caliphate. There's canon law in Catholicism, but it's not a big issue like right from the beginning, Christianity, first with Jesus of Nazareth, then with Paul of Tarsus, got rid of the idea that you have to, implement a law, define it more as like a faith, and, Protestants emphasize that more. So, we don't have the exact same tensions with Christianity between liberal state and Christianity as you have with Islam. But based on this, I wouldn't say Islam is exceptional. I would say Christianity is exceptional. Because when you look at the first, monotheistic faith, Judaism, you see, oh, yes, in Judaism you have halakha, and, its penal code is not much different from the Sharia. But somehow Jews were able to get around with that, and, today we are not speaking about a big tension between Judaism and liberalism. Well, in Israel, some people are speaking about a tension between Judaism and liberalism, looking at the ultra-Orthodox. But Judaism has gone through a lot of, reinterpretation as well, and halakha has been interpreted. And of course, there's no big caliphate issue in Judaism. They don't have a theocracy since the 1st century because it was destroyed by the Romans. But in the original, if you go back to the originals of Judaism, it was defined as a theocracy. So maybe and I very much am convinced that Islam is a religion that is very much like Judaism rather than Christianity, and Christianity has taken a different route as a religion without law, which is very surprising from a Semitic, Abrahamic point of view. So, no wonder, and I think therefore Islam can go through its own enlightenment, in which concepts like Sharia or Caliphate will be reinterpreted in ways where it would be more room for the individual, and which would accept certain liberal precepts. Now, why it should go through this, and is it really going through this? I mean, these are big questions. I can only just say this, well, actually, since the 19th century, there are a lot of efforts to bring an Islamic enlightenment. I mean, since the 19th century, Muslim reformists, renewalists, different names are given, have arose in the Ottoman Empire, in the Arab world, in Iran, and so on and so forth, and they've created interesting theories, interesting reinterpretations of Islam, which led to some important legal reforms. There was what the Albert Hourani called the liberal age in Arabic thought in the late 19th century. It had an Ottoman counterpart. It's not unheard of. So people ask, like, where's the Muslim John Locke? There are plenty of Muslim John Locke, wannabes, let's say. But, and they convince quite a few Muslims. There are Muslims who think like that. It's an effort that is going on. And if you say in the middle of it, this is a hopeless effort, it's not going to go anywhere, maybe we're just influencing in a negative way. But one more thing. Some people will say it's an effort that really needs nowhere. At the end of the day, the majority of Muslims think that liberalism is a heresy. At the end of the day, many Muslims are still living in a pre-enlightenment world and they're clinging on that. And I would say, while making this assessment, we should also realize that this is happening in a historical context. The efforts for reform, liberalization began in the Muslim world in the 19th century. The 19th century was also the beginning of Western colonialism, Western hegemony, and to aspire to an ideal while you're hating it for geostrategic reasons is a very tough position to be. Therefore, people like me find it very difficult when we say, let's aspire Western values and get these ideas of equality and freedom and so on and so forth, when, a Muslim city is being bombed by the Western, warplanes. It doesn't convince a lot of people. It creates a lot of reaction. It creates cultural reservation and protection and so on and so forth. Therefore, we should also see the burden of that historical context as well when we are judging the potential for what I call Islamic liberalism. And if you're going to do something, we should try to minimize the burden of that historical context as well, which means let's not have more wars and conquests and military conflicts. Let's just have more conversation between Muslims and the West. Let's not just demonize Muslims and put them out of a ghetto and rather make them see the blessings of a liberal society and to get more ideas to go forward.
Perfect.
Thanks so much. This is the beginning. Thanks so much.
First of all, thanks to the Center for Ethics and the COMPAS program for having me. It's always difficult to speak after a mind reader. So, before I get into Islam, I want to say a few words about liberalism. And the question, or the title, let's say, of this panel is Islam and the Liberal State. And I want to start off maybe by challenging the very framing and questioning whether it is the right framing. So we live in a time now where liberalism, and let me be clear, like Mustafa, I'm talking about the classical liberal tradition. I'm not talking about political liberalism, Democrats, the left in America. So we're talking about this kind of Enlightenment tradition. Liberalism as an idea is the dominant paradigm right now. So by asking whether or not Islam is compatible with liberalism, we're essentially asking Islam to bend itself to a dominant paradigm. We're essentially posing the question of whether or not Islam should make its peace with liberalism. And once we start the discussion in that way, Islam becomes not just a challenge, or perhaps even a threat, but Islam becomes a problem to be solved. So right now what Mustafa and I are doing, we're trying to solve a problem. And I think that that by itself can be a problematic way of having a discussion. We could maybe switch it around and say, well, perhaps liberalism should bend itself to Islam, whatever Islam might be, but I'll get to that later. Now, I think when we talk about liberalism, as Americans or Westerners, and I think everyone here, for the most part, I don't know all of you, but most of you are products of liberalism. I would assume that almost everyone in this room, with maybe one or two exceptions, is a liberal, a classical liberal. Now, because we're products of this environment, we assume, without really even questioning it, that liberalism is neutral. And as Mustafa described it, it sounds neutral because the idea is that in a liberal society, everyone can pursue their own conception of the good life in whatever way they want, as long as they're not harming anyone else. So it sounds neutral. If you want to be religious, if you want to be less religious, secular, socialist, whatever it might be. But liberalism is only neutral to those who are already liberals. If you're not a liberal, you will likely not consider liberalism to be value neutral. You will probably think that liberalism is ideological, and liberalism in some sense is an ideology with its own set of starting assumptions. So, I guess then it raises the question, why would we put a religion like Islam that has historically had its own ideological system under another ideological system? There's going to be a tension there. We have two, in a sense, clashing ideological systems. There's another thing too, is that liberalism, even though it's ostensibly about emphasizing choice and autonomy and agency, it can actually restrict choice and undermine pluralism. And an example of this is how a lot of us liberal elites will talk about religions. And I also call this the Ben Affleck approach to Islam. You might remember Ben Affleck making this case on national television that basically he literally said, Muslims like to eat sandwiches too. But the idea was that we're all basically the same, we all ultimately want the same things. And you'll often hear a lot of Muslims, American Muslims, in sort of an apologetic tone say, well, Islam is pretty much like other religions, we like, Islam is peaceful, we can be nice and friendly too, and so on and so forth. But if the three, let's just stick to the three major monotheistic religions here, if the three religions are all basically the same with the same ultimate truths, then what's the point of having different religions? We can just go from one religion to another because they're all basically the same. The whole point of religion is that they are different. They are meant to be different. They're meant to have distinctive truth claims. And I think that it's dangerous as kind of nice liberal elites on college campuses. We're so uncomfortable with difference that we want to say that, hey, we're all basically the same. I think we have to question that as well. Now, Mustafa sort of gave a little preview of at least part of my argument. It's not exactly a secret because the name of the book is Islamic Exceptionalism. Little plug there, but I mean, the argument is in the title. I do believe that Islam is fundamentally different than other religions, and Islam is exceptional. Now, I want to be careful about this, and I'm going to do the very quick, overgeneralized. So there is more nuance to the argument. So it might sound like these are sweeping generalizations, but Islam. So When I talk about exceptionalism, I'm not making a value judgment. Exceptionalism isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can be good or bad depending on the circumstances. I'm using exceptionalism here as a kind of descriptive argument, that this is the way Islam has been, and I'm also making a sort of argument about the future, that it's unlikely that Islam will go through the kind of liberalizing reforms that Mustafa talks about. But let's just talk about what's happened for the last 14 centuries, and let's not worry too much about the future right now. But I would argue that Islam, both in theory and practice, has proven to be resistant to secularization, unlike in particular Christianity. Now, the question would then be, why is that the case? How did Islam become different in this particular regard? And I'm someone who believes in the founding moments of religions, which is again not a very popular thing, because someone might say, well, why are you going back 14 centuries to talk about our current state? Well, presumably founding moments should matter, especially for Muslims, but also for all religions. Just as Christians go back to Christ, Muslims care about what Prophet Muhammad said or did. That is the founding moment. Also, the Quran was revealed in the founding moment, which isn't to say that Muslims are bound to their founding moment. It's just to say that Muslims can't fully escape their founding moment. But more importantly, why would they want to escape their founding moment? Muslims presumably would want to embrace their founding moment. Now, this is where an important contrast. I think Mustafa and I agree on this part of it, that if you look at Christianity's founding moment, Jesus was not a political figure, at least in the sense of being a politician who was involved in law and governance. Obviously, his message had major political implications, of course. But Jesus was a dissident against a reigning state, where Muhammad was not just a preacher or a man of God or a theologian or a prophet. He was also quite explicitly a politician, and not just a politician. He was also a head of state, and not just a head of state, but a state builder. So the fact that Muhammad, in his very person, intertwines these different functions from the very founding moment, presumably would be relevant to Islam's evolution over the past 14 centuries. And if you want to separate the religious and political functions, you run into a difficulty, because you essentially have to argue against the prophetic model. You can do it, and I think Mustafa has strong arguments in this regard, but you do sort of have to argue against the prophetic model to one degree or another. The second factor that contributes to exceptionalism that I'll just mention very quickly here has to do with the Quran. So this is complicated, but the short version is that, so let's say you talk to Christian evangelicals, they'll sometimes describe the Bible as the Word of God. Fine. Muslims go one step further than that, that the Quran is not just the Word of God, it's God's actual speech. This might sound like a semantic difference. I actually think it's quite important. So even if you go to the most strict conservative Christian evangelicals, whether today or in previous centuries, they would not argue that the Bible, or let's say the New Testament specifically, is God's actual speech. They would say there is some role for human authorship, and we know that certain books of the Bible were written by men. No one argues with that. Where in the case of Islam, to be theologically Muslim, you pretty much have to believe that the Quran is God's actual speech. In other words, it's not just influenced by God or divinely inspired, but that every letter and word is directly from God. That the Quran as a whole is divine speech. Muhammad did not play any particular role in the actual textual content. This is a major difference, and it is a major difference not only between Islam and Christianity, but also Islam and Judaism. Those are just two examples, and there are obviously others. We can talk about the legal system, which is tied to the two factors that I just mentioned, but I won't repeat what Mustafa said. But Christianity does not have a legal system. There isn't anything called Christian law. So when we're making comparisons between Christian evangelicals, let's say in America, and Islamist movements like the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East, there is a fundamental difference that Christian evangelicals here in the US are not talking about the implementation of Christian law. That wouldn't make any sense because Christian law does not exist. So I'll just close by saying, well, where do we go from here? What are the major implications? So I will acknowledge that perhaps in some kind of ideal state, an enlightenment process would be preferable for Islam and for Muslims. I myself share Mustafa's, personally here, I share Mustafa's liberal sensibilities. I would never want to live under an Islamic state, even if it's democratically elected, an Islamist party comes to power through elections. I would not want to live under that state. There's only one state I want to live under, and it happens to be a liberal state, the US. I think this is, at least for me as an American Muslim, the best place I could possibly live, even better than Sweden, believe it or not. But putting all that, putting all that aside, I think the danger of asking for an enlightenment or demanding enlightenment is that it can very quickly lead to a kind of forced imposition. So if you take my premise that Islam is exceptional in its relationship to law and governance, then maybe the answer is that there has to be a liberalizing power at the top that essentially pushes Muslims to be more liberal and or secular. Because otherwise, how exactly would it happen? Clearly, through democratic processes, Muslims are not voting for liberal parties. Generally speaking, Muslims, at least in Muslim-majority countries, have tended to vote for either Islamist parties or socially conservative parties, if they have the chance. And there is actually quite a bit of a history where even in the Christian context, the Enlightenment and the post-Reformation period more generally was not very democratic. You had Enlightenment philosophers who were essentially arguing that the masses were a problem and that liberalism had to come top down. And I worry that if we use some of those same ideas and rhetoric and narratives, that we will essentially be asking for a similar trajectory where we kind of look for the wise men and women perhaps and elites, and essentially it's their job to liberalize, and the masses have to sort of accept that. And once the masses become sufficiently liberal or find a way to minimize the role of religion in public life, and they come to terms with that, then and only then can we have real democracy. And then perhaps Muslims will actually vote for classically liberal parties. So I worry about those implications in particular. So I'll end there. Thank you.
I have to tell you, I've been hearing about Shadi Hamid long before the book came out, because my brother was his roommate as a scholar. So, there's all kinds of juicy material. So it's great to put a face to this name. And of course, I left my copy there, but I of course read Mustafa's book. You can plug your book, wave your book around.
That's the way.
Why don't you read the book that I wrote?
Oh, yeah, sure. I was going to sign it for you.
Oh, yeah, I wrote it. So when I wrote my first book, which is about American Muslims and their relationship to Islamic movements in the Middle East, I made the rookie mistake choosing an ironic title. Never do that again. I called the book Islam is a Foreign Country, American Muslims in the Crisis of Religious Authority. So when I chose that title, it was really, I almost called the book Where in the World is the Muslim World? It's not a place, it's an idea. That was of course before the talk of a Muslim ban would become just sort of a normal feature of our everyday life. So a lot of people who are fans of the Muslim ban, of course, find my book on Amazon and think that maybe this would be something they'd be into, and they buy it and they're disappointed. So I guess that's one good outcome. But what I've basically been doing for that book and for the current book that I'm working on, essentially what I've been thinking about is questions around the questions, essentially a debate within liberal societies around tolerance. And when you look at the case of Muslim minorities, particularly in the U.S., you find that there's actually a twin set of debates. One is the debate about Muslim minorities, how much can we tolerate them? Okay. Second debate, which is related, is about us looking outward as saving the world, directing the world, leading the world as a liberal state. How do we make Muslim societies more tolerant, right? So there's a really interesting contradiction and tension there. And so I guess because I'm sort of swimming in those contradictions all the time, I'm always frustrated when we immediately assume that the problem is that actually that Muslims don't understand liberalism, or that they need to be taught it, or that liberalism is, or secularism is somehow a subtraction story, or religion has sort of been cleaned out of everyday life, except for the private sphere. I mean, these things are very simplistic, and I'm going to give a couple cases today about the ways in which the picture is actually quite messy. I'll give you just a little vignette because I'm an anthropologist and we do that. I just came from Greece and I was in the refugee camps in Greece. I was also in Athens. And this week I wrote a piece for The Atlantic, which they gave a very provocative title, which is something like Muslim refugees and Greek anarchists team up to shame the Greek government, the EU, and the NGOs. Right, like the left and Muslims, like 2 fifth columns in Europe. Oh no, it's a clickable title. Anyway, the reason they chose this title, obviously, is to attract attention, because in fact that's actually the far right's rhetoric in Europe, which is that these really like anarcho-communist leftists basically, and Muslims are these two sort of threats to Europe. And I have to say, hanging out with these Greek anarchists, I mean, they make American Antifa look like little bunnies. These people are doing some really serious stuff, but so are the Muslim refugees, and they're really actually calling out the EU and Greece and frankly Turkey on their commitment to liberalism. So one of the ways they're doing that is that since the EU-Turkey deal, actually conditions for refugees have actually gotten much worse. This is the most expensive humanitarian crisis in human history, if you look at it per money devoted per person. And yet the conditions in refugee camps in Greece are actually worse, far worse, than they are in war-torn regions of the world, like refugee camps in Afghanistan or in Palestinian territories are actually, people have more access to water, bathrooms, just very, very basic food. So why are conditions in Greece being compared? Why are the camps in Greece being compared to Nazi camps? Why are those camps the mayor of Lesbos, one of the islands, is now suing the Greek military because he says that they created Europe's Guantanamo Bay on that island. What's going on? It's a deterrent policy, which we can talk about. But the uplifting story that I wrote in The Atlantic is actually about those Muslim refugees who either escaped the camps or are waiting for asylum in Athens, and the ways in which they have been taking over abandoned buildings and creating squats. And so there's about 1,000 people that have lived in this hotel that I write about called City Plaza. And so, I asked the anarchists, I said, well, all these refugees aren't leftists, so how did this work out? Like, how did you guys, strange bedfellows, right? And they said, well, yeah, we know they don't come because they're leftists. They come because, they want shelter, food, a bathroom. They're homeless, right? This is our response to this crisis of homelessness created by the refugee problem that has been a mess. And without resources, without money from the NGOs, without money from the government, they've been taking over these buildings. And what happens is, they've done things like, so for example, if the water company wants to turn the water off, they build a human chain. The hotel that I looked at was actually in the neighborhood that is essentially a fascist neighborhood, has the highest votes for the fascist party, and they essentially pushed the fascists out. So it's actually incredibly interesting. But what's going on in these squats is they're actually questioning really a fundamental premise of our liberal states and capitalism, which is that are the human rights to water, shelter, food, more pressing than the idea of private land ownership as a value, right? That's kind of a fundamental core question that they're challenging. And so, as I said, this is a kind of more extreme example. I don't see it scaling up completely. But I do think what it shows us is that a lot of these refugees who are, some of them are spring activists, they don't need an education in what liberalism is. They're actually quite sophisticated politically. They're activists. They're bringing their own understandings of dissent, democracy, whether the government owns them or not. They're not these sort of empty vessels that need to be filled and taught lessons of what liberalism is or isn't. It made me think of this picture that I have up here for you, which was actually, this was in 2014, protests against Israel for what they were doing in Gaza, including shutting off the water. And that's what I thought of when I was in Greece. This was the largest protest against Israel for Palestinians in Michigan, and it's a very large Arab American population. And of course, one of the reasons it was so large is because the issues around water being shut off in Detroit converged. You remember this issue, right? And Flint, also another case. Of like, what exactly is the state's responsibility, which was providing very basic things like water to its people? And so those two issues really converged. The rhetoric right now around the Muslim ban, which of course, we're going to see in the Supreme Court case. One of the things that we tend to do now is we talk about Trump as a sort of as this exception, as an aberrant case. But if we look at a kind of history lesson, banning Muslims from U.S. borders and withholding U.S. citizenship based on race or religion is neither a new practice nor an exclusively conservative policy. Do you remember that? In 1944, U.S. of course denied citizenship to Muslims as well as to Christians with Muslim ancestry. The same thing is playing out in Europe now. So refugees who try to convert out of Islam are still considered Muslim oftentimes by certain states. And having that legal racial status of white was a prerequisite to naturalization until 1952. And of course, we know that since 9/11, there's been all kinds of policies that are effectively racially profiling Muslims, even though they use other ways of getting at that question through immigration or around charitable giving or other kinds of legal maneuvering that happens. So in other words, the policies essentially work around the question of religious discrimination and racial discrimination, but in effect, so they're not like that in name, but they are like that in effect. All right, so let me just move on. So the reason I did not want to bring up Trump's Muslim address, which I've also thought a lot about, I wanted to remind us of Obama's Muslim world address. Remember when Obama gave his Cairo address to the Muslim world, one of the things, this is a wordle. So a wordle is when they pull up the words that were used most frequently in the speech. And so you see all of the kinds of things that I was trying to say before about what Muslims need to be taught in the so-called Muslim world, about progress, about liberalism, about freedom, etc. So you could sort of get a picture of what he's talking about there. Peace, also women's rights, the notes that we are so familiar with. But he used American Muslims in a really interesting way. He said, since our founding, American Muslims have enriched the U.S. They've fought in our wars, served in our government, stood for civil rights, started businesses, taught at our universities, excelled in our sports arenas, won Nobel Prizes, etc. He goes on, talks about Muhammad Ali and other cases. And so in this speech, Obama essentially setting up American Muslims as examples, proof of American liberalism working. We treat our minorities well, unlike Muslim societies where religious minorities or sexual minorities and women are in such peril, right? That's one thing. But the other way he's using American Muslims here is actually as examples. So they're both exemplars and examples for the Muslim world. If only the rest of the Muslims on this planet could act more like American Muslims. Okay. And he goes on to talk about Keith Ellison, a guy who's sworn in on how to interpret the Quran, and Muhammad Ali and others. So, of course, we know, and I'm going to talk about this in a few minutes, in fact, the situation for how American Muslims are treated is actually much more complicated, so I'll talk about that in a minute. I want to now just quickly jump to France. I didn't time this exactly right. How many of you remember the burkini ban? Yes, okay. All right, so that's a burkini, okay? Right there, the woman at the bottom. That's the woman who was actually asked to remove her clothing at the beach. So you might notice that she's first of all not wearing a burkini. She's wearing basically a hoodie. So if this had been called the hoodie ban, I think this would have been a very different global conversation that like France is banning people from wearing gym clothes at the beach. But because it was called the burkini ban, although she's not wearing a bikini, it took on a different valence. Okay, so for a lot of Americans, when they see that, oh, France is doing that, and we have a very rudimentary understanding of religious freedom, we think their secularism is messed up. We would never do that. And we're really into the idea of people marching to their own drumbeat, wear what you want. This would never happen in America. Well, the reason it was legal, it is legal, it makes perfect sense, and it draws on a perfectly liberal logic, is because of the ways in which we think about belief and the ways in which religion is actually built into our legal system. So here I'm drawing on the work of my colleague Fernando. In other words, if Christianity is imagined as putting like belief at the center, at the heart of religion, then every other religion is measured against that. And my colleague Tisa Rivera will probably talk more about this later today because she's an expert on this stuff. So the question really became, is the veil a sign of belief or the burkini? Or is it a means of achieving and cultivating a particular ethos, modesty, right? In other words, is it just a symbol of their Islam, or does this thing actually do something? So of course, for many believing Muslims, they think that actually wearing the veil or dressing modestly makes them more modest people, and that's a virtue. And so, built into this sort of secular law are all these ideas about interiority and exteriority, symbols, the mind, body, all this stuff is built into it. And so the idea of the burkini ban or the niqab bans or the hijab bans, wherever they are, is, can't you keep your beliefs to yourself, like as in inside yourself? These are conspicuous signs, you don't want to see them. And so, all these other ways of imagining what the hijab could mean is a religious duty and ethical practice. Those things are not legible in this liberal framework. And so the logic of the ban is essentially if the practice as sign ostensibly has no effect on the believer's conscience, i.e. you can still believe in hijab, just don't wear it. You can believe in burkinis or modesty, but just don't show it. We don't want our eyes to be burned by your burkini. Right? That's essentially the logic. So why is that? How does that make sense? Well, if we look at something, if we consider this, what we normally call secular, but it's actually profoundly Christian, there's this distinction between conscience and manifestations. And the European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms guarantees us to all the right of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, as well as the right to manifest one's religion or belief in worship, teaching, practice, and observance. However, Article 92 immediately places certain limitations on that letter of freedom in the interest of public safety, for the protection of public order, health, and morals, for the protection of rights and freedoms of others. I can see I'm not listening.
No, it's actually, we're ahead of schedule.
Okay, good, all right.
Slow down.
Okay, so, obviously there was a global response to the burkini ban. So this was one of the viral photos that was going around on Twitter and other social media feeds. And the question, of course, here is that, well, how come these French nuns can splash around the beach and nobody minds them? Well, because they're not wearing bikinis, of course. So in other words, this modesty is not seen as offensive or problematic, right? But of course, this critique is basically a critique of, well, religious discrimination, we need to apply the same rules to everybody. What Fernando is arguing is actually much deeper, which is that actually built into the secular law, are all these Christian presumptions of what religion even is, which is belief, not practice. I mean, Muslims might imagine, and Sikhs actually, imagine turbans or hijabs as a religious practice that is co-constitutive of their moral selves along with their beliefs. This is a different understanding of what religion even is. And so obviously these nuns didn't create a moral panic. People, the liberals brought this up, or people on the left brought this up. And then of course there was this one, which I love. Any Daft Punk fans in the house? You know the new, you like The Weeknd, Starboy, anyway, so this was another kind of example of like, well, can we wear this to the beach, right? So you kind of have these ways of critiquing the ban, but all of them are working on a very superficial level of critique, which is simply like, let's treat everybody the same. So if they can wear this to the beach, then the Muslims should be able to wear bikinis. Wasn't able to get to the next level of, which is actually to interrogate the Christian foundations of what we call our empty secularism, or we consider this empty of religion secularism in our liberal states. No one's questioning whether France is an illiberal state, the way we question whether, is Tunisia really liberal? Is that really a liberal state? Do they really get liberalism? So this is something I just want to bring to your attention. attention. Okay, so my own work, and I'm not going to go into details on this, is actually about American Muslims and the question of reform and reforming Islam. So first of all, Muslims don't agree on the question of whether Islam even needs to be reformed, although I think you heard some examples of people, Muslims who do think Islam could be reformed, should be reformed, and how. For me, I'm not really interested in making a case one way or the other. As an anthropologist, for me, what's important is tracking those debates over time. And so one of the places those debates play out is in our national media, mainstream media, news media. And so I only looked at cases of what we call liberal media, or like at 11, I wasn't looking at even Fox News. I actually watched, I don't like horror movies, but I do watch Fox News. I haven't seen it in a while, but I have to say, last night I watched an episode about Trump's economic policy. It was. Have you seen Mother? It was scarier than anyway. So what you see, if you start looking at examples with American Muslim leaders, anyone know this guy, Faisal Darouf? So this guy was at the center of the so-called Ground Zero Mosque controversy. You remember that. And his book is called What's Right with Islam? I'm sorry, What's Right with America and What's Right with Islam. I think that's what it's called. If I'm reading it right. So I mean, this guy, he was working for the State Department. He was sort of the poster child of like an American Muslim who was like, I love America, flag wavy, 100%. I mean, there's a total convergence. We can totally get Islam on. We can make a liberal Islam. Don't worry. So when he was accused of being in Hezbollah, that was a moment when American Muslim leaders had to say, there is no sniff test that we can pass. This guy can't make the cut. When he's working for the State Department and going into the Muslim world and proselytizing to the Muslim world about how they need to be proper liberal citizens, and he can still be accused of being in Hezbollah, there really is there is no sort of safe space. And when we talk about assimilation so often, we talk about it as losing something against a subtraction story, but actually assimilation is also always about marking a difference. So it's always about kind of teaching an audience about, like in this case, what a good Muslim looks like as opposed to a bad Muslim. And so when you look at these stories, and I have several cases that I won't go into any details to quickly tell you about, what you see when you look at news media coverage of American Muslims, again and again, the underlying logic, no matter what the topic is or what element of Islam they want to reform, it always comes back to a security question on terrorism. So, for example, this is Hamza Yusuf, who I write about extensively. He's a white American Muslim preacher who studied in the deserts of Mauritania, or so the story goes. It's not exactly true, but he studied overseas for many years and comes back and becomes one of the most prominent American Muslims. He was the one who had the soundbite about Islam itself was highlighted in 9/11, the firefighters were martyrs, this kind of thing. So he did that, and he became, I mean, a lot of Muslims, he lost a lot of street credibility. They started calling him Hamza useless, and he was seen as George Bush's pet Muslim. He was working with the government. But when you look at stories about whenever he's in the media, he, of course, this is a natural thing to do. People get a microphone, they start talking about their own work. I've already mentioned it. I didn't write it on my blog. So people start talking about, here's what I do. And so he would, when he'd be in these media interviews, he'd start talking about his educational reform. Because if you really want to reform Islam, you better reform education. And hey, guess what? I've devoted my life to doing just that. And so if you see, this is from the LA Times, I believe. Islam has very few scholars at the very high levels. Most of the brilliant students in the Middle East now go into medicine and engineering. They don't go into philosophy. Almost every one of these terrorists that are identified, you will not find amongst them anyone who has a degree in philosophy, in literature, in humanities, in theology. I came out of the Enlightenment tradition, and I still believe in the best of the Enlightenment tradition, and I think Islam confirms and enhances that tradition. Okay, that will make an American audience go, phew! They're happy to know that one of the most popular Muslim religious preachers in this country is all about the Enlightenment and philosophy, and yeah, what are those terrorists, all engineers? That's kind of the story. But to a Muslim audience, when they read this, if you know anything about who Hamza Yusuf is, when he's talking about the Enlightenment tradition and the kind of education that he's proposing, it's actually a madrasa education. He's able to speak at two different registers, to a Muslim audience in a very different way than to the American general public audience that's reading these articles in the LA Times or in the New York Times. And so that's where, I think that there's in fact a complete disconnect between what how Muslim debates operate when Muslims are amongst themselves and talking about these questions, and how these debates get sort of packaged and consumed by a mainstream audience that actually has very little reference for these debates about Islamic reform, or very little religious literacy about Islam in the first place. I'm not going to go through the cases, I'll just say another case of this is the feminists. So it's not just Sufis that become media darlings. After 9/11, it's also Muslim feminists. So you can look at the Amna case, women imams. And so again, you can hear the same rhetoric about an Obama speech here by Asra Rahmani. She says, today in the dawn of a new day, history of Islam, this is the day that they had the women's prayer in New York. We're going to change history in the course of the Muslim world. America and the West have to deal with glass ceilings. We Muslim women have brick walls in front of us, and we're hammering them down. It is so that we can bust open the Muslim world for a better day. So again, American Muslims are being set up as the exceptional and exemplars for the rest of the planet, Muslims on this planet. Another person, Yasser Ghali, this is a more conservative guy. His project is theological. Hey, we want to solve terrorism. I've got a theological solution to that. And so the same kind of rhetoric. As American Muslims, we're in this special, we're the canary in the mine, we're in this special situation. We can teach, we can prevent terrorism, and we can teach the rest of the Muslim world about this. So just to quickly wrap it, and I'll go into more details on the cases if you'd like in the Q&A. When we talk about reform as a counterterrorism tool, which is what it's almost always represented as, and in the media, you see a number of common postures, no matter where those Muslims fall on the spectrum, from the left to the right. First of all, the victimization of Muslims and Islam itself, i.e. Islam was taken hostage on 9/11. The diagnosis of collective guilt. We're so sorry, we assume responsibility for this, for American Muslims to stop fundamentalists. The assurances to the public and the state that Islam can be rehabilitated, don't worry, we can make it liberal, and taking personal responsibility and pitching their own reform projects as an effective counterterrorism tool. So you see this happen over and over again. And I think what this really gets to is this fundamental question of social and legal citizenship. In other words, people can have passports or U.S. passports, but they're not conceived of as American citizens in the way others get to be, or they don't get to represent the nation. These are my places. This means I should really wrap it. But I just hope that the cases I've given us today can help us interrogate what we think we know about liberalism as well as what we think we know about Muslims and Islam. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for those incredibly rich presentations. We're going to have about 20 minutes now to have a discussion with the panel before we take a break and then have a Q&A with the audience. So please do take note of whatever questions or inquiries or points of discussion you'd like to take up when we shift into the Q&A with the audience. But to start, in a sense where the presentation started, the framing for this event was Islam and the liberal state. And I think in the first two presentations, there was a focus on the question of the compatibility and the relationship between these things, with a focus on the extent to which Islam is, can be, should be, will be compatible with liberalism. And Zareena's presentation was a little bit different. But I wanted to put a question to the panel that draws out something that I think Zareena was kind of going around to state explicitly, which is I think often when you think about Islam and the liberal state, this is the question that's presented, it's the one that we've discussed. Is Islam and liberalism compatible? But I wonder when we frame it that way, Islam and the liberal state, why is it that the question of what the liberal state does to Muslims, or its relationship to Muslims, the way that it forms and relates to Muslim identities and communities, why is that not part of the question? It tends to be more kind of unidirectional instead of multidirectional, or kind of going in both ways. So I just posed that to the panel, and anyone who'd like to kind of start us off on that discussion would be great, and then we can kind of see if anyone wants to
What do you
respond.
mean exactly? So the liberal state does what to Muslims? What do you have in mind specifically? in this
So
regard?
when these two things are put next to each other, Islam and the liberal state, the question is often the question, are Islam and liberalism compatible? But what about the question of how the liberal state relates to Muslims, right? So it's a dialectic relationship to some extent, which I think Mustafa's presentation got into a little bit when he talked about how the relationship of Muslims to liberalism is formed in a post-colonial context, and so you can't divorce questions about liberalism and Islam without thinking about the rise of liberalism, the rise of Western colonialism, and the relationship between that and Muslim states. So kind of thinking more about the relationship in the other direction, not this kind of abstract and possibly historical question, or abstract historical and specific question about whether it's compatible, but what is the relationship of the liberal state in particular context to Muslims, and how that informs the relationship, whether that's now or in a historical context.
Sure. I mean, I want to answer that and say a few things about the other points raised very wisely by the two other panelists.
Go ahead.
First of all, there are states that are ostensibly liberal, but not acting in very liberal ways when it comes to expression of religion, and especially by minority. And we've seen examples from France. And I think the higher the liberal states put a bar of assimilation, the more it will be difficult for Muslims to be a part of it. I mean, in France, the synthesis between Islam and liberalism will take place only when Muslim women take off their headscarves and none of them have a problem with eating pork. Well, that's not going to happen. And I think if that's the kind of ideal friendship you're pushing for, you're just actually undermining the very idea of French Muslimness. Because basically, by only being non-observant, Muslims will be ideal citizens of the liberal republic. That's not going to happen. I mean, some Muslims can become like that, that's fine. But I think, so there's a lot on the side of the liberal state to incorporate, minorities, immigrants, or people who are here for several generations. And I think the more liberalism is really liberal in the sense that tolerates diversity, the more it has a chance to create a functioning society. So this is about the issue of the liberal state. And of course, the foreign policy of that liberal state has a lot to do if that liberal state is bombing the villages of a minority, back at home. So there will be a lot of tensions within that liberal state itself. So it's not just one side. Now, I wanted to address one more thing, like Shadi asked, why would Muslims buy into liberalism? I mean, what's the point, right?
I didn't say.
Okay, I'm just paraphrasing. I'm just to make it more, sexy. To make it more but why would we expect from Muslims to, accept this liberal framework? Why would Islam bend itself for liberalism, as you would say, rather than liberalism bending itself for Islam? Now, first of all, just one thing. There are some aspects of liberalism that Muslims, like 99% of all Muslims, have already accepted. Abolition of slavery. I mean, slavery was there in classical Islam, as in all classical civilizations almost. Abolition of slavery came as encouraging, it was encouraged to men a mission, to free a slave in the Quran. But the institution was there in Sharia, it was there in the Ottoman Empire, it was there in Islam. The idea that nobody should be a slave came from England, the Ottoman Empire. And some people said this is against the Sharia, it's there. Only ISIS still says that, hence they re-established slavery in the middle of Iraq and Syria recently. But today, that modern liberal idea has been universally almost accepted by Muslims, including the Saudi authorities. It wasn't that easy, there was some reaction to that. So, why did this happen? Because, modernization does change societies. Modernization, even if you resist it, changes the way you look into the world. Now, why would still, though, Muslims would accept these ideas that people should be equal and free and opinions should be out there, nobody should be killed for anything? I think precisely for the same reason that the Westerners accepted liberalism They go through an experience, and at the end of which they say, this is better than what we have today. Like what? Like they kill each other for a century for being Sunni or Shia or Protestant or Catholic. At the end of which someone says, maybe we shouldn't kill each other for sex. And you say, yeah, maybe we shouldn't. I mean, maybe we should tolerate it. Maybe we shouldn't excommunicate. So, I mean, liberalism didn't just come out because some nice whining, dining liberals had threw ideas and people said, yeah, I think so, no.
But so, I mean, the interesting thing though is that we're having this discussion at a time when more and more Westerners are losing faith in the liberal project. So for the first time, we as Americans voted for our first illiberal Democrat. In other words, he was democratically elected, but he has an ambivalent relationship with classical liberalism and may even be opposed to it. But also Orban in Hungary, PIS in Poland, Duterte in the Philippines, the BJP in India. In some sense, Israel is a classically illiberal state, but very democratic, so there's a tension there. I mean, the list goes on. So Westerners, I just finished reading quite recently a book by Patrick Deneen called Why Liberalism Failed, which is getting a lot of hype in the kind of American popular discussion now. So I think that it's not just Muslims who are struggling with the liberal project. I think that Americans and Europeans are asking themselves, is this it? I mean, is there something after liberalism? Are there alternatives? Why shouldn't we be able to imagine alternatives? Oh, but I would say though, why not put the focus on small d democracy over small l liberalism? Why don't we say that, hey, Muslims in a given country, they should be able to decide through the ballot box whether or not they want to vote for liberal parties or illiberal parties. And if they decide over time, as you're suggesting, that they want to move in a more liberal direction, they can start voting for more liberal parties, instead of doing it the other way around.
Can I ask you? You want to say?
I was just going to say one thing. I just want to say something about your example of slavery. I mean, look, ISIS is trolling all of us, frankly. And what do they do? I mean, like, so there's their whole thing is like whatever you think we are, we're gonna be that and more. So you think we're barbarians, you think we're all these things. Well, let us show you how we can do it. Why do they people dress up in orange jumpsuits that get wrong before they kill them? This is all a kind of political theater. I mean, it's not only political theater, but that is a really important part of it. So bringing back slavery, I mean, no Muslim saw that coming. I mean, you couldn't find more, as you said, there wasn't a Muslim cleric probably on the planet that imagined that in the 21st century there would be a group, a Muslim movement that was like, we're bringing back concubines. And that just wasn't. But so there's that, and that's certainly trying to be provocative in a particular way. However, we do live in a world where human trafficking is actually very common all over the world. So when we talk about, so they're doing it in Islamic. They're marketing it as a kind of Islamic form that having a concubine is our Islamic right, all this stuff. But if we look at, for example, this summer, there was this, 2 months ago, there was this whole controversy. We're seeing it on the clip of what's happening in Libya. Is there slavery in Libya? Well, what is that coming out of? How is this happening? What's going on? Is there slavery in Libya? Well, this is directly related to the closing of the borders of Italy. In other words, human trafficking is a liberal problem. It's related to these capitalist liberal economies. And so I guess for me, it's like whenever we talk about, or Sunni Shia, Sunnis and Shias don't just kill each other for the fun of it or because of some theological fight that they've been having since the 7th century. I mean, it's particular cases. So like in Iraq, Saddam is in power. Sunnis and Shias aren't worried about killing each other because the power is distributed to whoever's in the Ba'athist party versus who's not. It's only after the U.S. comes in, right, and sort of gives particular privileges to someone, whether they're based on this religious difference, then that religious difference becomes sort of a front line in the battle. So I think that I think we have to be more specific and ground these examples and not talk about Sunnis and Shias just kill each other, Christians, Catholics and Protestants just kill each other, because religion makes you want to kill each other. Not really. It's only when difference is related to access to power that people start fighting.
If I can just throw one thing into the mix.
Can I say a few things?
Let me just throw one thing in the mix and I'll throw it back to you, which is, I think I was telling Shadi before we started that in some of the other, so I do a lot of work on how Muslims are policed in the national security state, but more recently I've been studying social movements in the United States with a focus on movement for Black lives. And one thing that's incredibly kind of interesting about these conversations, so Islam and liberalism or Islam and the liberal state, is that at a moment when liberalism is under deep attack and a deep crisis, right, because of Trump's election, because of the growing global inequality, which we see examples every day, including the refugee camps that Zareena was talking about. And yet, when we have the conversation Islam and liberal state, it's Islam that's in question and not liberalism, right? And why is that? So to kind of think about why it is that we can even have this, the question strikes me in some sense as almost ahistorical. Like I remember having these same panels when I was in college, like 15, 20 years ago. It's still a question, that doesn't make the question irrelevant, but why in a very different moment, historical time, this is still a persistent question I think is important to kind of think about, and in particular now, in this moment when liberalism is under deep critique because of the rise of fascism and all these other kind of factors that other people on the panel have been pointing to. So just to kind of throw that in there, in the mix. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, liberalism is of course under attack, and there are books coming out, The Death of Liberalism or the failure of liberalism and so on and so forth. Liberalism is under attacks, always. Marx attacked liberalism, fascists, attacked it. And we always hear the death of capitalism since the, it comes out because liberalism doesn't create heaven on earth. It doesn't promise heaven on earth. I think it's among other political ideologies we have tried, it's so far the best one. Can we imagine better ones? Yes, we can imagine. But right now, the alternatives to liberalism look darker to me compared to the other ones. Like the alternative to liberalism is socialism. We tried it, and we really had a very bad trial and error period throughout the 20th century. So, and of course, the fact that liberalism is being challenged in the West adds more to the problem. Interestingly, some of the people who challenge liberalism in the West do it ostensibly in the name of liberalism. They say we want to protect our liberal societies from immigrants who are not liberal. So here's a interesting conundrum. I don't buy into their argument, but we should also see that. Now, what will happen to liberalism and how it will go is a good question in itself. Are some of the contributions of classical liberalism things that also Islam and Muslims appreciate? Equality before law, individual freedom, and so on and so forth. You can agree whether these are good or not, but I'm interested in whether Muslims accept these things, or Islam would it. And the answer is complicated, as I said, and I'm in favor of going forward to that. Now, should we prioritize democracy or liberalism at this junction? And that's an important question. Honestly, I would prioritize liberalism. Not in the sense of supporting military coups against elected Islamists. You know what? Because, well, if you were an Ahmadi it's a minority sect, in a country like Pakistan, and there are elections, and the Sunni parties come to power, and they are the majority, and they pass a law that says that Ahmadis cannot claim to be Muslims, other than that, they're punished for that. Well, here is a democracy that really doesn't protect your rights. So we should, the problem there is illiberal democracy, as you rightly put, in your earlier book, Shadi. And therefore, I'm very worried about the tendency for illiberal democracy, where you have just elections as the definition of democracy. How do we put this? I mean, the question is, well, let there be elections and let anyone come to power, yes, but you have to protect the individuals and minorities, and how you do that is some constitutional liberalism.
But even in that case, Mustafa, so in the U.S. we do have a Bill of Rights, but that can be overridden if there's enough people who want to override it. So if 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 75% of the states want to ban Muslims from holding cabinet positions, they could theoretically do that. So
every constitutional court, and
every country, if 90% of a given country wants to do something very bad, it's very hard to stop them. So it's more of a continuum. It's not like some countries are liberal, some countries are not liberal.
I like the liberal end of the continuum. And there is a risk of masses coming to power and crushing the minorities. And that's the inherent tension in democracy from the very beginning, and we should be aware of that. It is everywhere. It is in the US, it is in France, it's in Austria, and it is in Turkey. You know, it's going on. One more thing on the Sunni. Of course, Sunni and Shia Muslims are not killing each other every day. I mean, that's not happening. You know, there are certain tensions in the Middle East today. There are certain conflicts. One of those conflicts, the Iraq War, was triggered certainly by the US occupation of Iraq. And either, you know, you would have Saddam versus, you know, both are bad options, but, you know, I admit that Western foreign policy has triggered some, you know, toxic dynamics and so on and so forth. However, there is also the fact that, well, you have some Salafis who think Shia has to be killed because they're heretics. I mean, they have that belief. I mean, when they will put that into practice, it depends on the political tension, it depends on whether they have the room for that and so on and so forth. But having that belief in itself is something you should put on the table. So can you make the Salafis accept a liberal framework that nobody should be killed for heresy? Well, that would be the ideal golden solution, but here is the tension, you know, at least the, you know, violence of it.
Okay, so I think it's probably too late to pose another question, so why don't we take our break, and then at 10:45 we'll come back for Q&A with the audience. Thank you. Please join me in thanking the panel.
We are also recording for posterity, so talking to this man.
Right, so Steve will be bringing around a mic if you raise your hand once you're recognized. So, Corey.
Hi. First, I'd like to thank all of you for a very, very interesting panel. I was saying how every time I come to one of these events, I realize how little I know about things that are really interesting. I just want to come back to Sunni and Shia and religious minorities in predominantly Muslim countries, because that seems at least to be a place where we would hope that liberalism would grow even in Muslim majority countries, because we're concerned about the suffering that in some countries Christians or other religious minorities experience. I think, Shadi, you were speaking about two ideologies. I'm a philosopher, so I'm interested in the conceptual question about whether, Islam and Sharia law has a space to recognize religious rights of those who practice other religions. Is there a possibility for a Muslim country under Sharia law to have lock-in religious toleration for other members of the society? Is that something that exists? Is that something that doesn't exist but is possible? Which I think is maybe a different question about how Sharia and Sunni, how Shia and Sunnis sort of actually treat each other and what the different questions are in different countries. But I guess my question is ideologically, what are the chances for a predominantly Muslim country to have religious toleration for religious minorities?
So it sounds like that question is for Shadi, so we'll start with you and then give them.
Yeah, so I mean, it depends what you mean by religious toleration. It's certainly possible under Islam and Islamic law. I mean, historically, there has been toleration of other religions. We can talk about the so-called Golden Age in Andalusia or the Abbasid Caliphate, where Jews and Christians, were in a better situation than many other places. And Muslim empires were better at dealing with minorities historically. Again, the standard in Christendom was the Dark Ages, so the kind of medieval era. But I think that if we're talking about the modern era, it's certainly possible. Part of the reason we don't know is, first of all, there aren't any, with the exception of, so there's Malaysia, Indonesia, and Pakistan. But in the Middle East, there are no democratic countries in the Arab world, certainly with the exception of Tunisia and Iraq to some extent, but Iraq is also going through civil conflict. So it's really hard to know how these things would play out if there was a more stable democratic system. Let's say Islamist parties came to power in Egypt. Let's say the Brotherhood stayed in power for longer than a year. There would be toleration of Christians because there would still be constitutional requirements of equality, where I think Christians wouldn't want to live under a Brotherhood-led government, is that they would not feel like the state represented them ideologically, religiously, or politically, just as I wouldn't want to live under a Christianist, if that existed, government that defined itself in explicitly Christian terms and used, say, the state media to promote Christian ideas. Presumably a Christian would not feel comfortable with that if the Brotherhood was Islamizing the educational curricula, using state media to promote sermons, Quranic recitation, whatever else it might be. But that said, alcohol consumption, you could have a situation where alcohol would be banned for Muslims, but Christians would still be. There are actually countries where that's more or less the way it works, that Christians can buy alcohol, but Muslims cannot, to one degree or another. Because for Christians, there's no reason to have an alcohol consumption ban, because Christians are not bound to Sharia's expectations in that regard, because they're not Muslim.
Well, there is religious toleration in classical Sharia, but it is a hierarchical toleration. Like Christianity and Judaism are allowed to exist. Not Arab paganism. Paganism was not tolerated at all, like idol worship. But other religions, and that was extended into Buddhism and Hinduism as well later. They were considered as flawed but still legitimate religions. That's why Jews and Christians could exist under Sharia for 14 centuries, in all these Islamic lands. And Jews, when they were persecuted in Europe, they came to the Islamic lands, which was more friendly to Jews compared to Christendom in most of the time, pre-modern era. So there was tolerance, but it was hierarchical in the sense that there were limitations. Christians and Jews had to pay an extra tax. They could not be government members. Their testimony in a court was less valuable than of a Muslim. They had to accept the supremacy of Islam. So that hierarchical tolerance was pretty great in medieval times where people were killed for their religion. But in the modern era, this started to look as unequal because the idea of equality emerged, modern idea. So today, a Sharia-based Muslim state would tolerate, but it would not accept the religious freedoms as we accept today. Apostasy would be criminal. You couldn't change from Islam to Christianity. You would be killed for that. Now, is there a case of a Islamic state still honoring the Sharia but doing significant reforms to accept a kind of lock-in rule? Yes, that is the late Ottoman Empire, I would tell you. I have a chapter about that in my book. The Ottomans in the mid-19th century began the Enlightenment, reform period, Tanzimat as we call it. And they didn't necessarily declare reforms within the Sharia, but they rendered a lot of Sharia clauses obsolete. And they established a constitution that grants religious freedom. So it became possible to be an apostate in the Ottoman Empire, if you will, or, so it had become kind of a liberalizing constitutional democracy at the very end. But that's a bygone experience.
But apostasy is not even allowed in secular-led governments and regimes in much of the Muslim world. So it's not just an Islam thing.
It's a national thing.
Yeah, these are socially conservative societies, so the idea, proselytization is very difficult to do pretty much anywhere, but certainly...
Not anywhere.
No, in Muslim majority countries, in most of them, certainly.
It's difficult. Not always legal, but difficult.
Well, I think it's good to ground these in actual cases. So if we look at like a place, so I'm actually doing work on religious minorities in Pakistan, my research, and so there's a couple of things that come up here. On the question of apostasy, I agree with what Mustafa was saying. This is a test case in terms of Islamic law because it was a capital crime. But even in a place like Saudi Arabia, I can't remember his name right now, but there was a cleric that made an argument this year, basically, or a fatwa or an legal argument, that we need to revisit whether apostasy should actually be a capital crime. In this day and age, people's attachments to religions are weakening generally, and we need to create space within Islamic law for people to be agnostic or even atheist and for that not to be criminalized. So this was very controversial in Saudi Arabia, but I mean, such voices exist and people are writing and publishing on this question. So even it's not just Tunisia that's sort of like, the exceptional case where everything's okay and every place else is like a mess. I wouldn't say that that's fair. When we look at missionizing, and the ability to missionize, well, if we're talking about a lot of different places around the world, there's many places where it's not actually difficult to be a Christian missionary in Muslim majority societies. So, and then other places where it's very difficult, like Morocco, places are very difficult.
Where are these places where it's easy?
So for example, Egypt is a great example. There's all these faith-based. Melanie McAllister's new book is all about these Christian faith-based organizations who are.
If you, there have been riots and people.
So
Egypt is one of the most intolerant countries when it comes to proselytization.
Are you talking about state law, or are you talking about?
No, like whether or not you can actually do it, whether that's based on custom or state law or whatever. Obviously Egypt's not an Islamic state.
So let's be a little more precise here. okay? So if we're talking about, is it legally possible to missionize in certain Muslim countries that's very difficult. I said Morocco is one where they're legislating around that. Egypt, legally, people have the right to missionize.
I wasn't making a legal.
Okay, so you're talking about people's bias. I mean, people slam the doors in the faces of, I don't know, let's not what is it?
Yeah.
No,
Yes,
but,
do you know what I mean?
but religion
Religion
has a cultural impact, and there is an idea that leaving Islam, regardless of what the government says, is something that is simply unacceptable, and that family members, would disown you, or there could be violence.
Yeah, that goes in all different directions. I mean, I have a Coptic friend who converted to Islam. His parents have spoken to his family in 40 years. I mean, this is, in other words, it goes both ways. And these things are very complicated on the ground socially. But if we're talking about liberalism as a political ideology, to sort of categorize it, well, in Muslim societies you can't missionize. I mean, that's actually a rhetoric of the alt-right, and that there's actually scholars who studied the ways in which this idea that Christians are suffering in Muslim lands is actually linked to things like the build-up to the Iraq War. That's why Abu Ghraib was so problematic for evangelicals, because they had been watching videos of Christians being tortured in Muslim lands. So suddenly, for a news story to be about, the U.S. soldiers torturing Muslims was like mental gymnastics for them. It was very difficult to get their minds around.
Sure, but do Muslims have more difficulty with proselytization than the other way around? I think we have to speak frankly and say yes. I mean, it's not even close in my view.
Really?
It just,
in this, I disagree with you on that.
No, I would just
okay, go ahead.
No.
I mean, Christians are being persecuted in Muslim lands, Muslim minorities are persecuted Muslims. Muslims and Christians are being persecuted together in China and India. So the world is full of persecution of all kinds.
But it's not all the same. We can't just
It's
be
not
like,
all the same. It's not
But
all the
I
same.
would one thing, like apostasy in Turkey, apostasy is not a crime, but Christian missionaries, it's not legal. You can be a Christian missionary. There are Christian missionaries, but some of them have been attacked and killed, and that shows a social intolerance, and that intolerance has something to do with religious culture, which has something to do deep down with the notion that someone who goes to the other religion is a traitor of sort. And so it is not black and white, and some alt-right people can be using it to some very bad ends, but there are serious religious freedom issues in the Muslim world, sometimes on a legal basis, sometimes on a cultural basis, and sometimes Muslims themselves are the victims of this, but there are these issues, and I think we will move forward when we accept, yes, here's this problem, but it shouldn't be, exaggerated.
Can I get in here for a quick second, Zareena?
Sure.
I mean, an interesting way, I think this goes back to the conversation we were having before the Q&A. So the question being posed right now is about how how Muslim societies can tolerate Christians. Do they persecute Christians? And yet again, going back to the Islam and liberal state question, we're not talking about, for example, can the United States tolerate Muslims? How does the United States persecute Muslims? The question of the Muslim ban and how that is seen as compatible, or what its relationship is with liberalism. Can Christianity tolerate Muslim and Islam? And sure, the United States is not a theocracy, but I think the relationship between U.S. statecraft and law and Christianity is very deep and intermixed. There was a comment earlier about there's no Christian law, and sure, again, technically that's not the case. There isn't. But I was thinking about, my kind of area is U.S. criminal law, and I was thinking about all of the different things that have been criminalized historically in the United States and continue to, that come very much out of a kind of Christian set of values, from polygamy to homosexuality, and a certain kind of relationship with race as well. So, I think there's some. I just wanted to throw that in.
So if we're going to, I guess just to build on that point, if we're going to talk about cases of Christian minorities being killed or beaten or their institutions being attacked, we should also look at places like the United States. I mean, my nieces live in Indiana, go to Sunday school. Someone called and threatened to shoot up the Sunday school shut down. That's also they're because they're perceived as missionizing by Islam. But legally, Muslims certainly have the right to proselytize their religion.
But you don't really think that the situation of minorities, of religious minorities in the U.S. in any way comparable to minorities in the Middle East. Again, I worry about these false equivalencies.
What I would say is that, you know, for me, specificity matters. So if we're going to talk about the entire region of the Middle East, I don't think that the entire region of the Middle East, that religious minorities are in peril in the entire region of the Middle East. You can look at specific cases. So let me just give one example. Let's go back to Egypt. So Egypt is certainly a case where the question of religious minorities is a burning issue. Okay, and great book by Sullivan Mahmoud on this exact topic of Coptics, the place of Coptics in Egypt. So I'll just give an example. How many of you remember the swine flu story? That was before the revolution, the Arab Spring. That story was reported in the U.S. media in a lot of different ways. But one of the ways it was reported was around the question of Christians in Egypt. Why? Because Christians in Egypt often are pig farmers, and the swine flu, people were panicking about the swine flu, and the government came in and they killed all the pigs, and these Christian pig farmers were economically devastated by this new policy, health policy. So this is like a kind of typical story about a Muslim society, you know, the religious minorities, sexual minorities, and of course we should look to a government's treatment of its minorities as a metric of the health of the society. Right? I absolutely agree with that. What was missing from those kinds of stories before the Arab Spring, before the Muslim Brotherhood came into power, was that government in Egypt is very repressive to Christian minorities. They're also very repressive to the religious majority of that country, which is religious Muslims. The Muslim Brotherhood, other Islamic movements. In other words, we're talking about repressive states that are hostile both to religious minorities and to Sunni Muslims. And this is something that I did research on. I work extensively in Egypt, and I know Shadi also works there. So that question of like, well, how does the government treat minority also has to be, and the assumption is that they're being treated differently than or worse than the majority. So first of all, that's the point of investigation. Secondly, it became really clear, I think, after the Arab Spring, that's the situation with the coup and whatnot. So now that notion has been destabilized about the place of Muslims in this majority societies. The second question, which is like hostility to, missionary movements. I mean, we have to look at the war on terror, the ways in which they've mobilized faith-based organizations that are Christian, and give them all kinds of privileges. This is seen as a colonial project, and it's not just are Christians coming into Egypt and doing something. It's what's actually happening here is linked to a larger political picture. So to just make the cause to simply analyze it purely as like what can Christians do and what can Muslims do in a vacuum is to actually miss the whole point.
It's funny because I was worried like with an hour Q&A, how many questions would it take? But the first question. Okay, Jenna.
So thank you so much. This is so interesting. So I want to sort of extend something that Zareena said in the in the presentation about about sort of problematizing what the liberal state is and the idea of like there's good Muslims and sort of using certain Muslims as exemplars in liberal ideology, and these are the people that are deserving of liberal rights. They're like the idea that the liberal state in general has a history of conferring human rights to people that have that have earned it in some ways. And so one way of thinking about, I think that's a really interesting question, and it's like I would just want to hear more about what you guys have to say about that. But one way of thinking about that is, liberalism has its sort of limits in terms of thinking about who deserves the rights, and there is this sort of there's also there's capital D democracy, right? This sort of in some ways it's a different ideology. It's this idea that everyone has it's the aspiration for everyone having equal worth, right, in a society, and what that means. So it's not just about procedural issues, but it's about seeing everyone as deserving of whatever other privileges everyone else in the society has and rights that everyone else has in the society. And so I'm wondering what would the question be about sort of Islam in the sort of democratic state, the capital D democratic state? How would how would the conversation be different, and would this idea of sort of like the way that the Muslim minorities in the United States, would that be different if we were thinking about the United States' aspiration to be a democratic society rather than a liberal society?
Well, I would define the capital D that you refer to as liberalism. I mean, by liberal, democracy is a system, liberalism is a political philosophy. Democracy is about elections, representation. What about the rights of the individuals in the system? Well, that brings you to liberalism. And in the West, democracy and liberalism have been synthesized so powerfully, it has become liberal democracy. So when people speak about democracy, they mean liberal democracy. But then you can have an alternative, illiberal democracy, where you have elections and representation, but the liberal rights are not accepted in its full. So you don't have religious freedom, you don't have freedom of speech, you have it in limited sense. So that gives you illiberal democracy. And the trend is towards a liberal democracy in many parts of the world, even in some Western countries today, you know, some people say. So these are, and one other thing I would add, like, which is what Shadi, you said Islam and liberalism are two different ideologies. I would not define Islam as an ideology.
Okay, I didn't call Islam an ideology. I said it's an ideological system that arises out of Islam.
Okay.
Because historically, you know, what the caliphate would be considered.
Exactly. Okay, then fair enough. I just wanted to say something on that. That's why, like, the question, I would not define Islam as an ideology. There has been ideologies that have emerged out of Islam, and there's a historical political legacy of Islam. The question is, how much of that is inherent to Islam? How much of that is Islam that the believer should be attached to? Like, is the caliphate a historical institution or a religious institution? Like, there happened to be something called the caliphate. Somebody established it right after Prophet Muhammad died. It said legacy of Islam as a civilization. There's one way of looking at that. The other way is to, it's a part of our religion to have somebody as a caliph, so we should establish it. And I think we can speak of Islam and liberalism only when we begin to speak Islam by understanding it in some more historical terms. Well, Prophet Muhammad did that, but that was a norm in 7th century Arabia. We should understand some lessons from that. We don't maybe necessarily have the same thing today. So that gives you some room to maneuver. And then you can go towards a more liberal solution. And I just wanted to emphasize that because therefore, when you put it like, why would you choose between Islam and liberalism? I said these are false choices. One is a political system, the other one is a religion, and religion in itself doesn't define necessarily the political order. Although historically, you know, a lot of politics has been built on top of that. And did I answer your question? I don't know, but
I just wanted to open, I
Open
mean, I
some
wanted to
things.
hear you guys talk a little bit more about it. Well,
I'm not sure I totally.
so I guess like, when you talk about liberalism or like the liberal state, you think about rights, right? And you often are thinking about like the rights to religion, like freedom of speech, freedoms that individuals have, right? And so, but I mean, talking about you know, certain places being democracies, the United States being a democracy, right? Like it has certain democratic procedures, but there's a lot of questions about whether or not like the amount of inequality in our society allows it to actually be a democratic state, right? And certain people have much more like voice, right, than other people, and so on and so forth.
that's why I said Sweden is maybe for some people better than liberal state, but
yeah.
it depends on what you mean by liberal.
Right. So I guess the question is, so it's like sometimes it's easy to pit Islam versus the liberal state because you're then focusing on these very specific like rights. But if you're actually what would happen if you were asking the question, well, what is the relationship or the, you know, like the way in which we can think about Islam in a democratic state with like the aspirations being like democratic citizenship rather than just sort of people in a society being afforded specific rights.
So I'm gonna probably do something that Zareena criticized earlier, making certain groups of people exemplars. But it's just my personal view as a member of this particular community, as an American Muslim. I sort of said it already, but I do think that there is something unusual about the U.S. when it comes to how religious minorities can live, especially those that are those that maybe want to express their religiosity in the public arena, which is more challenging and certainly in France, but also to a lesser extent in, say, Sweden and elsewhere, where secularism is more just the way things are assumed to be. So I think in that sense, if you talk to a lot of American Muslims, or at least some of them, they would say this is the best place to be a Muslim. And I will say, on the record, I'm fine with saying it, I think the best place to be a Muslim in the world is America. And when it comes to inequality, democracy doesn't necessitate equal voice. So there is going to be a built-in inequality because, some of these societies will be meritocratic in one way or another, and there's kind of so-called liberal elites, which have more voice, are more influential on the cultural level, let's say, and then, business people and others maybe on the right side of the spectrum can also influence politics with money. So I don't know if there's any society where there is equal voice, I guess that would be a different layer of democracy that maybe we could aspire to, but I don't think that necessarily undermines America's status as a democracy per se. Small d. Small d in the sense that the big D is the Democratic Party. So I guess you meant small, yeah.
I get it.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So by what metrics do you, when you say this is the best place to be a Muslim, America is the best place to be Muslim, I guess my question is, based on what? Like what's the comparison point? In terms of rights, in terms of what? Like in other words, this is a country where as a Muslim your Muslim identity gives you physical risk, depending on where you live especially, you might be more likely to go to prison. There's all kinds of, if you're a refugee, you'd probably be way better off if you were living in Germany than you were in the US. So I'm just trying to understand, like, what is it about America that it makes it the best place to be a Muslim?
That in almost every European country, there's sort of an ethnic or ethno-nationalist conception of citizenship that makes it hard for newly arrived immigrants to actually become German. So it's some would say impossible, but it certainly is difficult to become German, because what does it mean to be German? There isn't something called German ideas or the German dream per se. The French ideal is there, but that's very difficult for anyone who's religious to fully partake in that. And I think that if you go down the list, maybe Britain is a slight exception, but almost every other European country I can think of, it's very difficult to become. So where with my parents, for example, they can become American. There is no limitation to that.
Ethno-national, right? You feel like as your parents...
No, well, it's not. It's precisely not ethno-national. That's what makes it possible for my parents, who are born and raised in Egypt, to become American, because there is no ethnic conception of what it means to be American, at least ideally. There is something called the American, whatever.
Well, ideally, in Germany, there's ideally in Germany, right? It's also the idea is that you don't have to be white to be German. Is an idea.
Yeah, but you can become a German citizen, but you can't actually become German. There's no idea of becoming German, but you can become American. Anyone can, and that's what I think all of our parents were able to do. And that I think that the U.S. is one of, I would say, it's one of a very small number of countries where that's possible. I think it's absolutely remarkable that my parents could feel fully American and identify as such and feel no conflict. They are, practicing and maybe somewhat conservative. They don't have to choose between their Islamic practice or being Muslim and being American. And that division, that tension, is in a sense removed. Now, of course, that's not to say any of this is perfect, but but yeah, that's the basic idea.
Is the more provocative part of your statement, though, that it's better to be a Muslim in America than in a Muslim country?
Oh God, Muslim countries are the worst places to be Muslims. Oh God, that's the last place I'd ever want to be Muslim in Muslim countries. you look at, that's pretty much what I'm getting at. I mean, Muslim countries are pretty, at least in the
Well,
middle.
there are nuances of it.
Can I just tell you, I took my 10-year-old to Pakistan for about 2 months, and she didn't want to come back to America. So she's pretty happy being a Muslim in Pakistan. And I said, well, why is that? She said, like, grown-ups in Pakistan always have time for kids, first of all. They have this great show.
Can I-
You can go on and on. In other words, like, I just think that, like, we say, well, what makes it, I don't know, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the Muslims in America are so, I consult, all those happiness studies about Muslims are so happy in America compared to Europe. I'm the consultant on all those studies for Pew and all the other big places. And I just have to say that, I don't know, there's this narrative about Muslim life in the US, and Muslims are happy as a minority in the US overall, that is true.
Yeah.
Right? But in terms of, we'll start looking like how much their income is, their actual standard of living, we might be surprised that there's a lot of European cases where Muslims are actually doing better jobs.
Look, but here's the thing, ultimately what I'm expressing is a feeling. America, I don't want not to get all like over sentimental or dramatic, but I think that America is a faith. So when you tell me what's my evidence for my claim, America is an idea, it's a faith, it's a belief. It is not a nation state, at least not to me. I don't consider the U.S. is something beyond the nation state. Now, that's not a very popular view on college campuses. I get that America is evil and bad, and they let people like Donald Trump.
I'm an American Studies professor. Obviously, I love America.
Go ahead.
Well, I agree with Shadi that America is a great place to be a Muslim. It's just hard to get the visa. If you're not American, like me, and keep getting it all the time, renewing that
It's
visa.
also hard to give zakat. That's also.
I've like tried to observe Muslim. First of all, the Muslim world is nuanced. Let's put it that way. And of course, there are Muslim societies that are half free at least and not free at all. My wife is from Bosnia. That's a pretty cool place to be. Unless you're attacked by Serbian fascists. There was a genocide of Muslims by the Serbs in the 90s. So it's nuanced. The Muslim world is not just one place. But I think, yes, if you're looking for freedom, equality for law, America is pretty the best place. Canada is not terrible either. Let's keep Canada too. It's also like a country of immigrants and with a cool prime minister and everything. So it is true, and I've tried to observe Muslim attitudes about the West and contrast France and US. And overwhelmingly, I've seen Muslim complaints about France. It is about life in France. You have to take your headscarf off to be compatible with secularism. What is that? That's kind of tyrannical. It is. That the school doesn't allow a pork-free menu because it is against laicite, that you want a halal food. This kind of intolerance to observance, for example, is very much an issue in France, and it is there. In the US, no problem about these. Is there any problem? US foreign policy. People would have issues with US foreign policy. If they are Palestinians, if they're Arabs, they criticize US unilateral support for Israel. They will criticize US wars, drones, and all of that. But when it comes to life within the US, pretty much so. And I've seen that overwhelmingly sympathetic attitudes about that among Muslims. It's just, hard to get in.
So can I say, it's so funny, we're talking about it as though the only political issues that Muslims are invested in are like their own discrimination or their own rights. Muslims are invested in a lot of political issues. That's why I brought up the water rights issue in Detroit. It's not just U.S. foreign policy or policies that target Muslims. Muslims in the U.S., Muslims in Greece, Muslims in Germany are concerned about poverty, are concerned about healthcare, are concerned about many different kinds of political issues.
What does that have to do with liberalism, though?
No, but this is what I'm trying to say is that when in this conversation we're talking. The question is like, can Muslims be proper liberals? My point is simply that. Well, yeah, of course, yes, they can. They already are. They understand liberalism. They're politically engaged. It's not, so like when we talk about like Muslim happiness, that's not, to me, a metric of like, do they understand liberalism? Are Muslims in America are happy because they're proper liberals? Is that what you were kind of trying to say? Maybe I wasn't following you completely. When you started talking, it got very sentimental about how much you love America, and you know, I have nothing against that. I said I'm an American studies professor, so I study American patriotism, and that's great as a point of data. But I'm just trying to understand how your love of America as an idea, as a faith, what does that tell us about Muslims' capacity to be liberals? I mean, do you see what I mean? Like, you could be, I could be like, you know, someone who understands liberalism as a Muslim, as a Muslim, and as a citizen, and have a critique of not just U.S. foreign policy, but healthcare, women's rights, all kinds of things in the U.S. But maybe not have the same love and sentimentality that you do. Of course I do. I'm just saying pretend. Do you know what I mean?
I guess I'm just not entirely clear what water and poverty have to do with questions around liberty, because that's how this conversation started, talking about religious freedom and the ability to kind of practice your religion.
Well, that's exactly my point. Is that why are we imagining the contradictions of liberalism only in terms of the question of religious minority rights? Like access to clean water and not poisoning.
But liberalism is not supposed to promote necessarily better policy outcomes. That's not built into the liberal idea. You can still have very high levels of inequality and poverty in a fully liberal system. That's a different issue. Liberalism has nothing to say. I mean, has nothing to say about economic equality. I mean, as long as there's, I mean, I think that's a different issue, and I think it's a relevant and important one. That liberalism doesn't necessarily speak to that. Some would say that liberalism is actually errs on the side of overly capitalistic approaches to social organization. So
I'm gonna, since we only have 15 minutes left and there are many questions, I'm gonna, actually, why don't we take, can I see how many people have questions right now? Okay, so there's three. There's a gentleman in the back, this gentleman right here, and the one in the front. So let's hear from all three of them, and then we'll close it out discussing those questions.
Thank you very much. I'm teaching two courses. One is contemporary issues in the Middle East, another one is introduction to the modern Middle East. In my contemporary issues in the Middle East, we begin with the geography of the Middle East. Then we come to religions, and then Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So we discuss similarities and differences between the three monotheistic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The value of, let's take modesty, tolerance, equality, justice, forgiveness, generosity, not killing innocent people. So these are the commonalities. Then we come to Islam, which is the youngest of the three religions. So we discussed that in Islam, it is modesty, tolerance, is very much, when you start from the second chapter of the Quran, Al-Baqarah, you will see that wasatiyya is very much, so many places it has been mentioned. And then when it comes to the elective process, so to speak, that Muslims should decide their affair by consultation. Then when it comes to, let's take, not only in verses of the Quran, but in ahadith, for example, خَيْرُ الْأُمُورُ أَوْسَطُهَا, the best of the actions are which is the moderation. Then my students ask me the question, that do these extremist groups, non-state actors in the Middle East, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, ISIS, Hamas, do they read Quran, they know about the Quran or Hadith, or they do not know? I gave them my answer. And I'm just looking at how would you answer this question from one of my students, that whether these radical groups read Quran, Hadith, do they know about their own religion or not? If they're not, why not? If they do, why they do the acts that are really abhorrent to the whole civilization?
Okay, so just as a reminder, yeah, we're going to take the other questions before we open it up.
Yes, I'm going to be brief. I just want to hear a quick overview because repetition is good for me. The first speaker, you mentioned The question, was it liberal? Can Muslims be liberal? Or, well, here it is. It says here, it must be answered by Muslims, this question. I find that fascinating, that actually Muslims can answer this question, not non-Muslims. Okay, second speaker. If you can you say more about Islam? Is Islam a problem to be solved? Is it? Really? All right, last. And the speaker that mentioned, is it really the state's responsibility to care for Muslims? In other words, can Muslims care for themselves without state intervention? Those are my questions.
Thank you. One more in the front.
Yes, thank you very much. Now, what is the treatment of atheists and non-religious people in through the Muslim Arab states? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we have three very different questions. One that has three different parts. But I think what we'll do is, why don't we just start with whoever wants to start, and we kind of work through, and then we can kind of go back into discussion. So whatever aspects of the question you want to take through, go for it.
Okay, well, do the militants read the Quran and the Hadith? They do. I mean, not maybe the lower ranks who join ISIS. There are some people who join ISIS on the way to Syria. They read Islam for Dummies, and because they didn't know much actually, because they joined ISIS because they were filled with anger and hatred, and so on and so forth, and so they wanted some action. So there are examples of like that too. But we would be also, I think, wrong to think the people who established ISIS or Al-Qaeda don't read the Quran already. They do. They read it in a certain perspective, which is very militant and fanatic. I would say most of the issues we're speaking about, though, are not directly related to the Quran. They're more directly related to the Hadith, because the bulk of Sharia Islamic law comes from the Hadith. The Quran has some, verses that are legal, but very limited in scope. Apostasy, blasphemy, these issues are coming from the Hadith. And Hadith are sayings of Prophet Muhammad, of course, but written down almost 2 centuries after he died. So the Hadith are controversial, which ones are authentic, which ones are not. There's a big issue there. But the Islamic militants and Islamic moderates, they all read the Quran and Hadith, but they just understand different things from that. They take certain interpretive lenses. And that's why they come from different schools in Islam. Some are Salafi and non-violent, but some Salafi are and violent as well. And Salafi is the most ultra-orthodox, if you will, interpretation in Sunni Islam. Then there are more moderate Sunni groups, and then there are, let's say, post-Sunni or reformist Sunnis and progressive Sunnis, if you will. They all read the same Quran and Hadith, but they take, as it happens in other religious traditions. Of course, there are many verses in the Quran that we can use to promote freedom of religion, certain liberal ideas. I mean, I'm not going to say Quran is liberal, but I will tell you that the Quran has verses that seem to vindicate the idea of human freedom. No compulsion in religion, the famous verse, La ikraha fid din. But, the Saudis want to interpret the verse like that. They will put parentheses into it. They will say no compulsion in religion, or they will say no compulsion in the acceptance of religion only, which means you're not compelled to enter Islam, but you can't leave it. It's like Hotel California. So these are all, interpretations of the Quran, offered by different schools of thought. And regarding atheists, in in some Muslim majority states, atheism in itself is a crime. Like in Saudi Arabia, go out and say, hey, I'm an atheist, and they put you in jail, they flog you, and there are people in jail for that right now. In others, it's not. Egypt is considering to make it a crime now. There's a discussion in Egypt whether it should be a crime or not. Under the so-called liberal Sisi president, Sisi, right, who's a butcher, of the worst kind. But in Turkey, we don't have Sharia law. You can be an atheist, you can say it out loud, but if you insult Islam, there's a religious law saying, it's not a theocratic law, very interesting. It's not because you're offending God. If you're offending the religious sensibilities of a portion of the population, then that's a crime because you're offending the religious people. So there have been a few cases of Turkish atheists recently who joked about heaven and afterlife and so on and so forth, and they have been not flogged or anything, but put in jail for 2 years, or a few cases like that happened. So you can be an atheist in Turkey, but you should be a little bit careful about your language. And it depends. The funny thing is, Islamic law did not legislate atheism because as a category it didn't exist. There were polytheists, there were Jews and Christians, but a group called atheists did not exist. So they came out in the modern era, and what to do with them is, of course, of course it should be free, everything, and the question is, it's diverse. And I think there are 11 or 12 is predominantly Muslim majority countries who implement Sharia. And like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Afghanistan. So in those countries, being an atheist publicly would be heresy. And of course, it would be an apostasy if you were born a Muslim. That would be in itself a crime by definition. Other places, it would not be legally a problem, but people would think that you are like a corrupting influence in society. It would be pretty okay in Bosnia, or Albania, where there are already a lot of atheists. They've gone through communism and socialism. Or in Kazakhstan, that would be probably not a big issue. Again, these are all Muslim majority countries.
I just say a little bit more about the atheism issue. Exactly right. I agree with what Mustafa said. We need to make a distinction between social attitudes towards atheism, or the bias against atheists socially, versus their legal rights in these different places. But we also have to remember that even in our own society, Muslims just beat, barely, atheists as the most hated religious group in America by a national poll by Gallup. Right? So there's like a lot of aversion to atheism even in our society, right? And so you also find that in Muslim majority societies. But there are some where atheism is actually quite prevalent, but as Mustafa kind of pointed out, it's sort of kept on the down low, sort of quiet about it. Iran, for example, is a country actually that has a very high number of atheists based on survey research. In the U.S.,
thanks to the Islamic Republic.
Yeah.
It persecutes people in the name of Islam.
That's the funny thing, is it's just really interesting to see, look at where, so like Pakistan actually does not have a very, relative to other Muslim majority countries, atheism is not, the numbers are not as high as they are in other places like Iran based on the survey research. But if we look at the U.S., among Muslims who have left Islam, I think something like 20% of those Muslims who are no longer, who are raising Muslim families who are no longer identify as Muslims, 20% of them are Iranian Americans, right? So some of those trends that are happening in Muslim majority societies, you see them reflected back actually, even in the diaspora here in the U.S.
So, just to be clear, given the time, this is your time for your final comments. So I think most of those final comments are over. Just sorry because of the time. So Zareena, if you want to make any final comments and respond to the questions, and then Shadi, and we'll be done.
One more round we have?
No. That's fine, but this is going to be your last.
I like the gentleman who was giving us the bumper sticker version of our talks. I think my question was, the question was about what is this, or do Muslims need the state? Well, I guess my response is that can they take care of themselves, I think is the question that was posed to me. I think Muslims in the United States at least are really, can't get away from the state. So it doesn't really matter if they can't opt out. The state is always there, always listening, and intervening in their lives in all kinds of ways. And how do they get around the policies that restrict their religious activity, like giving the zakat, or opening mosques and schools, or other kinds of things? That's, I don't know, I think it's something that was worth looking at. So I guess for me, in this particular political moment, we've never seen, I don't know, a more, Muslims are a problem for the state, it's a problem population, and so that relationship is what I understand.
So on the first question, do extremists read the Quran? Do they actually read their own source material? I would basically agree with Mustafa. If we're talking about the leaders of these extremist groups, some of them are actually quite well read in the Quran and Hadith. Now they have a particular lens, and they have a way of interpreting which is not the mainstream or classical approach. So they end up with very different answers than, let's say, most scholars. But I would be very careful about this idea that extremists are not real Muslims. For that reason, I'm very uncomfortable with saying that ISIS are not, they're evil and terrible, but that doesn't take them outside of Islam. We shouldn't make the same mistake that ISIS makes. So ISIS takes people outside of Islam and says they're apostates. That would be somewhat odd if we did the same to ISIS in the name of moderation or whatever it might be. So, and I think that part of this has to do with, I hear it from my Muslim friends and colleagues sometimes, they want to show that Islam is good, nice, and moderate, so they have to find a way to de-Islamize ISIS and take ISIS outside of what we would call true Islam. But obviously we have no way of accessing true Islam. I have my own views about it, I think we all do, but once we start going into the true Islam as peaceful, I think that's a nonsensical debate because obviously, no religion should only be peaceful because any religion is also going to count for battle, especially a religion where in the founding moment there were battles. But putting all that aside, we do know that Baghdadi, for example, had a PhD in Quranic studies, and just talking about Salafis more generally, Salafis are, as Mustafa said, the ultra-Orthodox Islamists. I would never want to get in a religious debate or a theological debate with a Salafi because they beat me every time. Some of them, I would say Salafis know Quran and Hadith in and out. Again, they have a sort of unusual way of interpreting, but they know their stuff. So that's what I'd say about Salafis more generally. Now, on the other question, the bumper sticker summary of my talk, is Islam a problem to be solved? So I was trying to say that if we hold Islam to a liberal standard, that essentially we're problematizing Islam, and we are making Islam a problem to be solved. So I was actually criticizing that and saying we should be very careful about going down that route of making Islam a problem. And by holding liberalism as an ideal, I think that we can sometimes run the risk of going in that direction. That said, I do think that Islam shouldn't be a problem, but it is a problem in terms of everyday life, especially in places in Europe, in terms of questions of integration and assimilation. And I think for the rest of our lives, it'll be a pretty big issue simply because the Muslim population in Europe will go up significantly. So by 2050, according to the recent Pew report, if you kind of have a medium migration scenario, France will be about close to 20% Muslim, Sweden will be about 20% Muslim, and then if you go into the 2080s, obviously those trends might continue. So if we think that there's a problem around integration now, what will it be like in 2050, especially if you have the rise of illiberal parties throughout Europe? And so I think this will be a very big challenge, and it'll be a challenge for liberalism because as I think we've been saying, fear of Muslims being illiberal leads Western nations to move towards illiberalism themselves. So it's sort of illiberal counter illiberalism, and it becomes a sort of cycle. And I honestly sort of see that as basically the future, but I don't want to end on a negative. Yeah, I sort of see it as the future.
So, I don't know if other people saw this, maybe the academics in the room did. A couple months ago in The Guardian, there was an article by an academic arguing that the panel is dead. And I have to say this panel has restored my faith in